Unit 9, Globalization after 1900.
Subunit 1, Advances in Technology and Exchange. While the population of the world grew, globalization made the world feel smaller, as did advances in telecommunication technology. Starting in the early 1900s, radio brought news, music, and cultural events to a wide range of people. Later in the century, air travel and shipping containers, large standardized units that could be carried on a truck or train or stacked on ship, promoted the widespread movement of people and goods. Energy technologies such as the use of oil and nuclear power made it possible to transport goods faster and more cheaply than ever. The internet, first developed for the U.S. Defense Department during the Cold War, emerged as a regular tool of communication for much of the public by the late 1990s. Knowledge economies based on developing or sharing information took root in cities around the world. Decades before the internet, communication technologies were connecting people around the world. Television and radio ads encouraged people to reach out and touch someone by making a long-distance call. By the 1990s, mobile technology such as telephones put the tools of information creation and dissemination into the hands of individuals around the world. Twitter, Facebook, and other social networking sites made the media accessible to anyone, anywhere. The Green Revolution was in the mid-20th century, and it emerged as a possible long-term response to hunger. Scientists developed new varieties of wheat, rice, and other grains that had higher yields and greater resistance to pests, diseases, and drought. The new varieties were first developed by crossbreeding two varieties of a plant to create a hybrid. More recently, scientists have used genetic engineering, manipulating a cell or organism to change its basic characteristics. Farmers also used more irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticides. Energy technologies. In 1900, coal accounted for about half of the global energy consumed. As extraction, refinement, and transportation technologies allowed for widespread use, petroleum, also known as crude oil, and natural gas joined coal in fueling industrial output and helped increase productivity. Research in the 1930s and 40s that led to the atomic bomb also led to the first use of nuclear power plants to generate electricity for factories and homes. Medical innovations. Antibiotics were made from 1928. Scottish biologist Alexander Fleming was working in his lab in London when he accidentally discovered that a particular fungus produced a substance that killed bacteria. He had discovered penicillin. Penicillin was the first antibiotic. It was a useful agent in curing bacterial infections, and during World War II, it saved many soldiers' lives. Reliable birth control. Very popular today. Very popular. Another groundbreaking medical advance was birth control. In the early 1950s, scientist Gregory Pincus developed a birth control pill, a more reliable method than the barrier methods then in use, like a condom. Scientists tested the pill on women in 1950s, and the U.S. government approved for it for widespread use in 1960. Vaccines have existed since 1796, but governments and nonprofit organizations did not begin developing and widely distributing vaccines to prevent deadly diseases until after 1900.
Unit 9, Subunit 2, Technological Advancements and Limitations. Disease. With a combination of science and medicine, in addition to a government-run public health measure, illnesses and deaths were drastically reduced after 1900. These included things like pandemics, which were epidemic diseases that spread across national borders, and smallpox, which had plagued the ancient Egyptians and devastated the native populations of Americas and Australia. It killed millions of people each year. However, the WHO, World Health Organization, conducted a global vaccine to wipe out the disease. It was declared a success in 1979. Other diseases persisted, and those related to poverty, including malaria, tuberculosis, and cholera, and as well as other diseases or epidemics such as the flu, AIDS, and Ebola, have emerged. Gee whiz. Malaria, which is a parasitic disease spread by mosquitoes in tropical areas, has killed more than 600,000 people each year. Mostly were young African children. Doctors Without Borders treated about 1.7 million people annually. Experts believe, preventive approaches such as distributing mosquito nets with insecticide as cover during sleep can help reduce malaria. Another disease, tuberculosis, which is also associated with poverty, is an airborne infection that spreads through coughs and sneezes and affects the lungs. Before 1946, there was really no effective drug treatment that was available. However, a cure was developed that involved antibiotics and a long period of rest. In areas or countries where tuberculosis is common, vaccines are administered to children. Cholera is a bacterial disease that spreads through contaminated water. It causes about 95,000 deaths per year. Like tuberculosis and malaria, cholera affects mainly poor people in developing third world countries. You can counteract cholera by boiling or chlorinating drinking water, washing hands, and vaccines are readily available. However, they do not reduce the need to actually follow these methods. Polio is a disease caused by water contamination and is a virus transmitted in fecal matter. It once affected 100,000 people per year and could result in paralysis or even death. Jonas Salk announced in 1955 that there was an injectable vaccine against polio that was proven effective. 6 years later, Albert Sabin developed it and it became available. Vaccines were a global counterpiece that helped public health. HIV or AIDS is another disease that causes social disruption between 1981 and 2014. It killed more than 25 million people around the world. HIV weakens the immune system, so people are more easily to succumb to other illnesses. This is contracted through bodily fluids, usually unprotected sex, blood transfusions, or sharing intravenous needles. Research in disease was funded, and disease was usually associated with homosexual men and drug addicts. However, by the mid 1900s, researchers have found a way to treat disease but not cure it. Moving on to another epidemic, Ebola. It was discovered in the Congo in 1976 and is a deadly disease caused by a virus that infects the African fruit bat, humans, and other primates like monkeys. Humans get the virus from exposure to other fluids of infected people or animals. It causes bleeding, organ failure, and for most people who are infected, death. Now, let us move on to diseases that are associated with the longevity of humans. Heart disease is the most common death in developed countries, and it is a disease associated with lifestyle, genetics, and increased longevity. A team led by South African man named Christian Barnard in 1976 led a heart transplant, and Robert Jarvik led a team that designed an artificial heart used as a temporary device while the patient waited for a compatible heart. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia that affects elderly and sub-middle-aged people and is becoming an increasingly higher concern. People do not recognize their loved ones, and since it undermines bodily function, it usually leads to death.
Subunit 9, Technology and the Environment. During the 20th and 21st centuries, human agriculture, industrial, and other commercial activity contributed to the many environmental challenges that led to increased competition for increasingly scarce resources. These problems include deforestation, which got rid of forests, desertification, the removal of natural vegetation cover through expansion and intensive use of agriculture lands in arid and semi-arid lands, a decline in air quality as a result of increased pollutions in the air. Now, there's some causes of these environmental changes, such as population growth. In the year 1900, the world population was 1.6 billion, and then in the year 2000, 100 years later, it's 6.12 billion, which is a lot more.
A lot.
Then there's urbanization, which was another cause. By some estimates, by 2025, 5.1 billion people will live in cities, which will pressure those who grow food to use intensive farming methods that deplete the soil and cause erosion to clear more forests for agricultural use. Then there's globalization and industrialization. The global reach of industrialization has also affected the environment as industry spread to developing countries. Energy and other natural resources used in manufacturing were in demand, drawing further on the reserves of resources. Now, I'm going to discuss the effects of environmental changes, such as resource depletion. Pretty soon, there's going to be a lack of resources that are not refillable, such as petroleum, because it takes a long time for petroleum to be formed. And there's also an issue with water scarcity in countries where they do not have direct access to a large quantity of fresh water. There's changes in the atmosphere due to factories, automobiles, airplanes, and many other products and processes of industrialization that have emitted huge amounts of pollutants, including carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. They build up in the atmosphere and let heat of the sun reach the earth, but trap it from escaping earth. There's also been a development of renewable energy resources. Because of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, petroleum, and natural gas being depleted, then we have come up with things that can be renewable, such as electricity from the sun that we can use in electric cars. There's also increasing environmental awareness, and people have joined a green party that is focused on environment issues. Air pollutants and greenhouse gases prompted debates about rising temperatures. Scientists, including those on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, cited data showing that emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases caused by the burning of fossil fuels were causing global warming. This is an increase of the average temperature in the world. Experts advised governments to reduce their country's carbon footprint, the amount of carbon dioxide that each person produces. Increasing global temperatures led to calls to action. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Future-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg raged in a speech at a United Nations climate conference in 2018, beginning with a solo protest in her native Sweden. Thunberg eventually led a global climate strike with more than 1.6 million participants in more than 125 countries. What should people call the time period we live in? Traditionally, geologists have called the current period the Holocene epoch. Holocene means entirely recent. This time period started about 11,700 years ago, at the end of the last significant ice age. However, some scientists believe humans have left the Holocene. They wanted to call the present time the Anthropocene. The time means new man. These scientists wanted to change the name because humans now affect almost the entire planet. In 2019, a panel of scientists voted to approve the name. Anthropocene reflects the idea that humans are the strongest influence on the Earth's climate and environment, for better and for worse.
Unit 9, Subunit 4, Economic in the Gold Age, Global Age. After the Cold War, global trade exploded. The economy had a new emphasis on market-oriented policies that were advocated by leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They wanted to cut taxes, regulations, and government assistance to the poor as a way to promote economic growth. It was a flawed choice that produced greater wealth for many, but hardships for others. Globalization is the interaction among people, governments, and companies of the world. The Indian Ocean trade and European imperialism are both examples of globalization, but it usually refers to the increased integration of the economy after the 1970s. The bloc nations under the USSR traded freely with the capitalist democracies, and India and other countries that were part of the non-alignment movement during the Cold War relaxed restrictions on the trade in the 1990s. This opened up the country's economy, which is called economic liberalization. Reagan and Thatcher wanted free markets, which were basically markets of economy that were based on supply and demand, with little government control as possible. Both of them were strong nationalist corporations that used the shift in emphasis to move jobs to countries with lower wages, taxes, and fewer regulations. This was an exploitation of labor and environmental damage. In Chile, in 1973, Augusto Pinochet took power in a U.S.-backed coup against a democracy elected socialist government, which was led by Salvador Allende. Pinochet died in 2016 before he was actually convicted for his violent tactics that were basically kidnapping, torture, money laundering, and murder. But during his rule, the economy took a turn away from state control to a free market approach, which had a goal on privatizing formerly state-run businesses and taming the serious inflation that Chile was experiencing. There were economic reforms in China when, in 1981, Deng Xiaoping became the Chinese leader. The communism-backed party backed away from its commitment to economic equality. He called his policy, "Let's get some people rich first." They opened up their economy, like replacing colonies with peasant-released plots of land where the peasants could grow their own crops, allowed factories to produce more products for customers, encouraged foreign companies to set up factories in special economic zones, and reopened the Shanghai stock market. Some people in China thought these reforms should be accompanied by political reforms like freedom of speech, press, and the end of communism. But a demonstration of this, which was in Tiananmen Square was met by soldiers using guns, killing hundreds upon hundreds of people. It was just horrible. A knowledge economy is an economy that creates, distributes, and uses knowledge, information, designers, engineers, teachers, and other jobs in the knowledge economy that uses information and communication. In Finland, which was an agrarian economy in the 1950s, but it followed other European countries in, industrialization after World War II, when the Soviet Union collapsed, which was a main customer. Finland lost a lot of, their main customers and entered, a little bit of a crisis. But by entering the global marketplace, encouraging competition, and establishing the Science and Technological Policy Council, the economic growth through technology and information, it experienced growth, and it invested in education and communication technologies. In Japan, they encouraged the exports of goods, they discouraged imports, and they prepared its citizens to be productive workers. These policies aided large investments from the U.S. and other countries, which turned Japan into a manufacturing powerhouse. Absolute powerhouse. There were 4 states that followed Japan's economic model. These were called the Asian Tigers, RAR, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They prospered through government business partnerships, high exports, intense education, and a low-wage workforce. Fascinating. Vietnam and Bangladesh were importers who purchased their manufactured goods from China and were finding other options in Asian countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, which had labor costs that were significantly lower than China and have become known for their exports in clothing, like the iPhone or something like that. The U.S., in Canada, and Mexico negotiated NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and encouraged U.S. and Canadian industries to build maquiladoras, or factories in Mexico that used low-wage Mexican labor and produced tariff-free goods for foreign export. Labor unions complained that NAFTA led to the export of thousands of jobs of the U.S. to Mexico, where wages were low and the environment standards were weaker, which is, that's not good. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, took over GATS, I think that's how you pronounce it, operations. The WTO made rules that governed basically 90% of international trade. It became, in part of its power, the organization became controversial because meetings were closed to the public, so no seeing, and board members represented corporate interests. They also favored trade over consideration of moral concerns, like when they have strict application of rules, and a member nation refused to buy clothing made by sweatshop labor could suffer sanctions from the organization. Moving on to multinational corporations. Multinational corporations are legally incorporated into one country, but that makes or sells goods or services in more than one country. The joint stock companies of the commercial revolution, such as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, were the earliest examples of a multinational corporation. In modern times, those corporations take advantage of both knowledge economies and more manufacturing and industrial economies. Examples are Microsoft and Google and Nestle.
Subunit 9 calls for reform and responses.
Subunit 5.
I said that. In the age of global economics, global transportation and communication, and global devastation from war, human rights were for the first time also elevated to the level of global discourse, which challenged long-held assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. Efforts to establish and safeguard human rights opened doors of educational and professional opportunity and political participation for some who had previously been excluded. People sought liberation from the continuing bondage, in Nelson Mandela's terms, that kept them in poverty. People around the globe also began to protest the inequalities and the environmental damage that globalization had created or reinforced. Since its creation, the United Nations has promoted human rights, basic protections that are common to all people. As part of its humanitarian work, the UN created the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund in 1946 to provide food for children in Europe who were still suffering more than a year after the end of World War II. In 1948, the UN formalized its position on human rights in the Universal Declaration. Since that time, the UN has investigated abuses in human rights such as genocide, war crimes, government oppression, and crimes against women. Another example of this fight was feminism. I love feminism.
We love feminists.
And there should be more feminism. There was also feminism. So the first International Women's Day celebration was March 1911. Steps towards gender equality. During the 20th century, men and women made great strides towards securing some of their rights and participating more fully in professional and political life. In the first part of the century, the percentage of women who could read and who attended college increased. And in country after country, women won the right to vote. However, not all the women in a country won the right to vote at the same time. In the United States, for example, white women won the right to vote in national elections in 1920, but Native American and African American did not have full voting rights. Steps towards racial equality. Through 1965, Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discriminating based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which banned discrimination in voting. The federal government stepped in to protect the rights of all citizens, African Americans who sought equality of education through desegregation of schools. South Africa's system of apartheid instituted in 1948, enforced the segregation of people based on race. Although white South Africans made up only 15% of South Africa's population, apartheid reserved good jobs and other privileges just for them. So-called pass laws required black South Americans to carry identity documents when entering areas set aside for whites, which they often had to do when traveling to their jobs. "I'm not interested in picking up crumbs of compassion," said Desmond Tutu, Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, South Africa, and human rights activist. "I want the full menu of rights," like he's at a restaurant. In 1964, Nelson Mandela, a leader of African National Congress, ANC, challenged apartheid and was imprisoned for life for doing that. Another example of racism was the caste system in India. And in China, China was now a iconic powerhouse from its reforms in the 1980s and 90s. Tiananmen Square. Chinese intellectuals and students had a history of protesting against their government, based on the May 4th movement in 1919. In the spring of 1989, pro-democracy activists organized a public event mourning the death of a sympathetic high official. The protesters demanded a chance to speak with the Chinese leaders about freedom of the press and other reforms. After the Chinese government refused to meet with the activists, citizens in more than 400 Chinese cities staged sit-ins, refused to attend classes, and began hunger strikes. Steps towards environmental repair. Earth Day. Starting in 1970, citizens in the United States designated April 22nd each year as Earth Day, a day for people to focus on environmental awareness. Organizers hoped to highlight recycling, developing alternative energy, eating locally grown and organic foods, and passing anti-pollution legislation. Today, about 174 countries observe and participate in Earth Day activities with the Green Day Network, or the Earth Day Network, an environmental advocacy group. Steps towards economic fairness. To counterbalance the strictly commercial interests of the powerful World Trade Organization, organizations from around the world combined resources to create the World Fair Trade Organization In 1989, member organizations subscribed to the following 10 principles of fair trade, and the WFTO monitors its members to make sure they follow these principles.
So the last 4 subunits that we didn't save, so I have to redo them all. But we did do them together, and they were done before, so. Unit 9, Subunit 6, Globalized Culture. Due to social and political developments, writers, painters, and musicians developed modernism, which was a rejection of tradition in favor of experimentation and uncertainty. After World War I and World War II, wealthier nations began to develop consumer culture, which was a culture that focused more on what they owned and bought than where they lived or what they did for a living. After the World War One, II, and the Cold War, nations began less on competition and more as cooperative regional organizations such as the European Union and NAFTA, as well as the WTO. People questioned long-held beliefs about humans and their environment. Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Jean-Paul Sartre are all examples of this. Artistic changes like the Harlem Renaissance, which was a rebirth of African American culture in the 20th century, saw African Americans distancing themselves from the stereotypical portrayal in literature. Jazz emerged as an international language. Pop culture was now not for the educated elite only, but for everyday people through radio, motion pictures, and television. People saw Americanization, which was when people all over the world learned more about the U.S. and the U.S. learned about the rest of the world. American consumer culture was turned to throwaway culture. They objected to the waste and pollution that was part of the focus on newer, cheaper, and more disposable products. English spread throughout the world, and in the 21st century, about 300 million people in China were learning English. Global brands such as Apple, Nike, and Rolex emerged. Online commerce places like Amazon for everywhere and Alibaba, mostly in Asia, sold products at a higher tax. Pop culture around the world, like Bollywood in Mumbai, saw a film industry that made more than any other country in the world and blended different styles. Anime, you can ask Harry Singh about that. Reggae was a Jamaican style of music that blended with New Orleans jazz in the 1960s. K-pop, which is Korean music, Harry Singh, emerged through streaming video sites like YouTube and others. Malala Yousafzai used social media like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and other forums to empower her movement. Global sports and culture saw diffusion in the Olympic Games and World Cup. Resistance to globalization, 9.7. Globalization was brought about through different organizations and institutions such as the Monetary Fund, IMF, and the WTO. Some countries like North Korea resisted economic and cultural. Some, such as Saudi Arabia and China, have resisted cultural globalization. The organizations that contributed to the growth of global economies include the GATT, the European Economic Union, the MESCOR in South America, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, that were formed in the 1947 and early 1990s. In 1995, the WTO took over GATT operation. The WTO makes rules for more than 90% of international trade. The Battle of Seattle was when in 1999 protesters erupted at the WTO conference Seattle. The WTO planned to have a round of trade negotiations for the new millennium. This was the beginning of the anti-globalization movement. Why do people resist globalization? Well, that's because consumers in the early 21st century had its origins in child labor in West Africa. Working conditions in Western nations could be harsh, like Amazon employees had intense pressure to fill orders at the risk of being fired. The collapse of the Rana Plaza factory was an 8-story building that killed 1,000 people and 2,500 people were injured. Environmental damages increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the environment. Threats to national sovereignty. It harms children, workers, and the environment. What do these anti-globalists favor? Well, that's human rights, which are basic freedoms like expression of opinion. Fair trade that ensures people who put out those goods or services have reasonable payment for it. Sustainable development, which means businesses that allow people and companies to make a profit without preventing generations from meeting their own needs. And debt relief or restructuring. The unrest resulted from tensions between members of the Han ethnicity and members of the Uyghur ethnicity. Most are Muslim. Chinese authorities blamed riots on social unrest based on Twitter and Facebook, banned on platforms. Unit 9.8 Institutions developing in a globalized world. After World War I, the League of Nations was developed with the goal to resolve international disputes and prevent another world war. However, after failing, the UN was created after World War II, I believe. So, and the UN has 6 main bodies that implement its work called assemblies. The General Assembly decides questions on peace and security. The Security Council debates its military use of force against a country for violating UN principles. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative arm that leads and influences the entire organization. The International Court of Justice settles disputes countries bring to its international law. The Economic and Social Council is the largest, most complex. It directs economic, social, humanitarian, and cultural activities. The Trustee Council supervises the government of trust territories like Israel, Papua New Guinea, and Nauru. The UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like freedom from slavery, equality, nationality, right to property, freedom of thought, equal pay, and equal work. The UN means to be peacekeeping. The UN also has other missions like protecting refugees from famine and natural disaster, feeding the hungry. It started the WFP to provide food aid, supporting education, science, and culture. World War II destroyed libraries, schools, and museums. The UN created the UNESCO that repaired war damage and developed literacy, free education. It also has other missions. The WHO aims to improve human health by controlling epidemics and providing vaccines. UNICEF was created to help children after World War II. The UN Human Rights Watch, or the HRW, monitors human rights abuses, and it also global goals like wiping out hunger, and poverty. The NGO works independently of the UN. It maintains world peace and improved communication. The World Bank, created in 1944, fought poverty and provided loans to countries, focusing on dams and roads, later expanded to social projects like education, disease prevention. The IMF was designed to help a country's economic state by promoting stable currency and exchange rates. Unit 9, Subunit 9, Continuity and Change in a Globalized World. This is like the 5th time I've had to record this. This is crazy. Okay. Scientific theories and developments in technology have led to theories being brought about for the origin of the universe. Big Bang is the most predominant one. Wave science, discoveries, extended human knowledge, and use of radio, light, sound, and microwaves have led to improvements in cellular communication and faster internet service. Medical science, experts made discoveries about germs, viruses, disease in the human body. These led to cures or vaccines in common diseases like polio, tuberculosis, and tennis. Nuclear power has become a significant source of energy. Renewable energy sources, including wind, solar, and thermal energy, became much cheaper to produce. This led to greater production of material goods and faster transportation. Radio and television further developed telephone coverage that increased the global transfer of information. Airplanes that were invented in the 20th century and later jet airplanes closed the distance between regions of the world and increased interactions among cultures. Scientists produced genetically modified crops that were more resistant to drought. The Green Revolution led to a higher population growth rate within developing countries especially. Women in this era began to experience an increase in socioeconomic status. Women began to enter career fields that were traditionally reserved for men. The right to vote in elections were legalized, and they held higher political offices in nations than before, if at all. Political changes showed mass protests movements helped bring about social and political change. In India, they showed how effectively to use civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to wage social and political change. Environmental change has been apparent in airborne pollution increased as factories, automobiles, and homes got their power from carbon-based fuels. Water pollution also increased as people and companies dumped waste into rivers, lakes, and oceans. This also led to polar ice caps beginning to melt, more intense catastrophic weather events occurring, and higher temperatures around the globe. Thank you for watching.